5 years. But in fact, Joe asked me to talk about this forgotten campaign that Sue talked about, Greenham Common, and then Chitra asked me to sing. And so I'm going to try to kind of combine, I can't obviously sing the whole song, but fragments of this, because I want to kind of bring this Greenham Common experience a little bit more back to life, because it shouldn't be forgotten. It's in most of our living memories, or your mother's living memories, and yet, you're quite right, it's been written out, and recently talk about, direct action, non-violent direct action, and you think it began with Swampy and the roads, and yet the creative, the challenging, the effective non-violent direct action attached to political, environmental, anti-nuclear work, those techniques, we really developed at Greenham, and they were usually by the Rhodes protesters, but because the Rhodes protesters were mixed, what you got was a lot of images of boys up trees and down tunnels, and the women got written out of it again. And the women didn't get written out of Greenham Common for at least a few years because we were women only. And people forget that. And we also, for a while, tried to insist on having actually women's representation through the media. But so let me just remind you of just something. This, an iconic picture. These are 44 women dancing on the nuclear weapons silos in a very drizzly dawn of 1983. And this image on that New Year's Day went around the world. It was the first item on the news, here in the UK, and it went around the world. Internationally, people still remember this. In this country, do they? Many of us served time in Holloway Prison for this action, non-violent action with ladders. Then other kinds of... Well, because in those days, and here I'm going to talk a bit, in those days we actually believed that we shouldn't cut the fences because we were totally committed to non-violence. But we began to also understand that sometimes when you've got fences and fences and fences surrounding nuclear weapons, then you have to open doors and windows. And if you have to do that with bolt cutters, with your friends, then that's okay, as long as you're not threatening or harming any people, including the soldiers or the police. That was very odd. And in doing that, we kind of reawakened our understanding of why the suffragettes had ended up chucking stones through windows. And so, here's a couple of other, because they wouldn't let me bring my bolt cutters into Parliament today. Here's a few other symbols. And the ribbons, the suffragette colours, we all know. A rush on Parliament, we know the suffragettes did it. Do we know that Greenham did it in January of 1983? Over 70 of us actually chained or roped or ribboned ourselves. We actually got into the circular thing. We nearly got into the House of Commons. A few of us were just stopped at the door. And then 70 of us were penned, maybe the first example of kettling, of St. Stephen's, where we carried on raucously singing, and various MPs, some men as well as women, people like Claire Short, actually, Joe Richardson, Jeremy Corbyn, people like that, would come down, Tony Benn, make sure that we had water and that we were able to get to the toilet, so not quite like kettling. And there we were, there we had to stay until Parliament rose. So Climate Rush, and we were so happy to see the women of Climate Rush take this idea and run it through. But did they know that we had done it too? No, because it's been written out of their history too. And we need to write it back in, not so that we can say, yeah, we did it first. No, it's so that we can say we're continuing along a stream going right back into history of women doing these kinds of things and then being forgotten and then being reawoken. We helped to reawaken the memory of the suffragettes through Greenham. We occupied air traffic control towers when there were weapons in the base. We blocked the convoys. We threw what we call gloop, pink porridge. Now, anyone who's ever had to wipe off porridge after it's got very, very stuck and hard on sort of women know this. So we mixed our pink paint with porridge and we threw it in gloops, and sometimes we got close enough that we blocked and painted women's symbols and things onto the very dark kind of camouflage of the trucks. And we transformed the concept of direct action because we began to realise that the traditional concept of passive resistance didn't work for women. A lot of women who came to Greenham had experienced violence in their homes. They'd either seen or experienced violence where a woman lying down and being passive in the face of violence was actually what the men expected. And that was very disempowering for women. So for women, we had to reclaim a different kind of non-violent direct action. And it was very active and it was very challenging, but it didn't harm people. But it was prepared to harm property to get certain messages across. And we did it together and we looked after each other together. And things like the Bolt Cutters and the Remembrance of the Witches, these came through. And so this is one of the songs I know Chitra wants me to remind of. Who are the witches? Where do they come from? Maybe your great-great-grandmother was one. Witches are wild, wise women, they say. There's a lot of witch in every woman today. We found that one of the last witches had actually been hanged on Greenham Common. And we had a second verse for that. Whose are these Bolt Cutters? Where do they come from? Maybe your great-great-grandmother had some. Grannies are cutting the fences today. There's a lot of holes in Greenham fences today. We got a lot of criticism from feminists too. The 1970s feminists found us quite hard to deal with because here we were women, we were clearly feminists, but we were not just arguing on what were considered women's issues like abortion and pay and so on. We were there insisting on a feminist analysis of violence in the state as well, although we actually did take a lot of as part of what we did a lot of work around violence against women. But we took on, the state violence against all of us, and nuclear weapons, and we did that, in an unashamedly feminist way. But but it meant that some media tried to portray us as concerned housewives and mothers and grandmothers sometimes. And then overnight, when we were blockading the base, suddenly we were transformed into burly lesbians. Same women doing it, of course. Many of the concerned housewives, mothers, and grandmothers were lesbians too. And so, but we refused to allow them to put us in these boxes. And frankly, the traditional left and the traditional CND peace movement also found us difficult to deal with, because there we were highlighting a mainstream issue like peace, nuclear weapons, and we were doing it as women and demanding that we were respected for doing it as women only, because that we had different ways that we wanted to explore, different ways of doing it that didn't fit into the box categories, and it meant that we kind of moved forward in different ways. Now, I'm conscious of time, so let me just talk a bit about the historical impact, because I think Greenham has that. The empowerment of women who felt alienated and disenfranchised from mainstream feminist and peace politics. Women against pit closures. These were women who would come down to Greenham in the early days with miners to support us. But when the miners' strike started, they suddenly realised that there was something they could do as women. And there was a lot of toing and froing. I was arrested, well, many of us were arrested. A lot of toing and froing, especially with certain of the gays, like Blue Gay, had a lot of connection back with miners' communities. And so, and worked with women against pit closures. And there was, that kind of thing. But also, young women who were running away either because of violence at home or because they didn't fit or they didn't feel they fit. They had difficulties very often around sexuality. Where did they go? They went to Greenham. Actually, the police even picked up women sleeping rough in local parks, coming to Greenham. If Greenham wasn't there, and Greenham isn't there now, where did they go? A lot of those young women end up on the streets. So Greenham actually provided that means. It was always a social work thing, except that it was a social work thing where nobody was able to be patronising to anyone else because we were all in it together. So we were all learning, and we were all making mistakes and growing and trying to make this work. The international recognition, I'm astonished when I go internationally. Women in black made connections with Greenham when it first started. The Sandinista women. We are far better known internationally. Women in the Pacific working against the bases, maybe US bases in the Pacific. Far more known about internationally, and still now, than we seem to be known about in the UK. We were half-forgotten bridge between the suffragettes and today's environmental movement and climate rush and so on. Our direct action was funny, it was challenging. We, the use of of action and messages that still finds its way carrying through into our work. The work with prisoners. Many of us ended up in prison, not for very long, but we learned something there and went on and tried to take those issues out further about women's rights. I was going to sing you the Holloway song, but I can see that we're kind of running out. We were stigmatised as lesbians, and that was one way, both within the peace movement and at the point at which the state really wanted to get rid of us and wanted to discredit us, it was lumping us all in as that. And we took that label, whether women were heterosexual, bisexual, or lesbian, we all took that label and said, so what? Are you just saying that lesbians aren't allowed to protect ourselves against nuclear war? I don't think so. And so, and it was lesbians from Greenham that abseiled into the House of Lords that occupied the BBC News. And Lesbian Avengers, Clause 28. And so, Greenham women are still at a radical kind of level within anti-nuclear and security and peace and environmental campaigning, very often within mixed groups. And we've seen this with Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp, been going more than 25 years now. We saw this with Faslane 365, which blockaded Faslane. Suddenly, loads of Greenham women were coming out of the woodwork and organising their own groups, often as mixed groups, going up and blockading Faslane. But we did some women only. So there's a history that should not be forgotten because we were part of it. And it's a history that has a legacy for us to keep learning from and to keep connecting into our activism. So thank you. Okay. Quite often when I would be making up songs, I would use tunes that people knew. And there was one that we specifically using Brixton Prison, which was in a lonely Holloway prison, where the Greenham women lay. All around them doors were locking, and their sisters far away. Well, that was an early song, and it went on about, memories of Greenham and this sort of thing. But then there was the ones that we started singing for and with the women in Holloway, and this was a particularly popular one. Oh, Holloway, where the living is drear, food like poison, got no rights at all, but we'll keep on singing till the day we leave here. They cannot silence us at all. Different verses, different women in the prison would ask me for verses. You can see, with that one, you had to sing it with that very loud voice. I've got a cold, but very loud voice because you had to be able to sing it across the prison with your face pressed up between the narrow bar-like window.